What we're going to do is we're looking at how do I flow water into the truck, right? So off of a fixed point where I'm actually hooking up a piece of hose to my truck and flowing water in it. Wow, we got that as close as we possibly could without. That might work. Give it a shot. Might be a little snug. Okay, so how do we do that, and why do we do it the way we do it? Go ahead and turn that valve on and flow me water up to this truck. Obviously we can top fill, and there's nothing wrong with top filling. Looks like that's gonna work. Actually might work better than it did last time. We did this just the other day, but it was a little choppy, so kind of do a little bit of redo on it. So I flow water up here, and you'll notice I'm coming in my draft, my suction, my number 8, right? That's how water's supposed to flow through this truck, into your number 8, and then through the piping system, the way that it's designed. So, as with every operation, I close everything. Now everything's closed. Every time I operate a fire truck, I close everything, and then I open what I want to open to get water into it, and then I open what I want to make water go somewhere. In this case, we are just looking to flow water back into our tank. So I don't have to prime it, I don't even have to run my pump. The water will flow through the pump and right through my number 2, right back into my tank. So if I'm just looking to fill up my tank, all I have to do is come over here to my number 2, open that up, and that should be flowing water into my tank, except that it's not because I didn't open my number 8. Now it's flowing water. Okay, I should be overfilling here any second. That's the process. Okay, so why do I do that process? What else could I possibly do? What's the wrong way? The wrong way to do it is to leave your number 1 open, because if you open that up, you'll see the hose went limp, because it's flowing water straight into the tank. This is bad. It's not as bad with this setup, because I know what this is flowing, but when you don't know what it's flowing and what pressures are coming into it, that can cause a lot of damage to your tank. It'll break the baffles, it'll break where the baffles weld to the plastic tank. On the inside, it can break the seam of that tank. I did it for years on a Type 3, not knowing that I shouldn't do that. And eventually I pulled up on a fire and rolled up and stopped at a little bit of an angle, about 100 gallons sloshed out of the tank of my Type 3 engine. And yeah, I looked like an idiot. My AFMO was like, what the hell's wrong with your truck? It's leaking water like a lot. We didn't know. Anyway, they can be fixed. It's a pain. You have to remove everything off of here, have somebody climb in there and plastic weld it back together. You don't want to do that. So that is not the preferred alternative. However, if you flow it through the system and you open your number 2, just like you were drafting, there's controls in that system to keep it from overpressurizing that tank. This is how the water is engineered to flow into your truck. So that's how you should do it. It's the same thing with a Type 3. We'll do an example of that here next. Other reasons that I do it this way instead of any other way. Backflow prevention. So backflow prevention is really important, especially if you work for certain agencies that really key into it and make it really important. But a lot of the time they don't really understand what we're talking about or how this works for backflow prevention. So where's the hazard? The hazard is contaminating a water supply or contaminating the water system with water in my tank or even water in my hose. A little tiny bit's not going to be a big deal because there's a drain in that system before it gets back into the water main. But it doesn't take very long before we've contaminated a water system. That's really expensive to fix. How does this work as backflow prevention? This works for backflow prevention because if something happens to my water delivery in my water system, like somebody digs up a water main and probably contaminates the water supply, but whatever. They dig up a water main and the water flows backwards in the system, or somebody opens up a 5-inch on a hydrant just down the road and they create some negative pressure and this all flows backwards, it collapses this hose, this soft suction hose. Because there's check valves in place in this system, it doesn't allow the water from the tank, even when it's full, with a little bit of head pressure, to flow back down this hose and keep the hose rigid. Or keep the hose rigid enough to where it will flow any water. So that's how you get backflow prevention, doing it this way. If you go straight backwards into your tank, no check valves in place. So you're not actually providing particularly good backflow prevention, even though any significant draw is probably still going to collapse that hose. But if you're running 2-inch line, it may, or 2.5-inch line, it may not. So that is the key to how to fill off the direct flow type line. Now, people say, well, I have this number 13 gravity drain. It's a drain, not a fill port. It does not have a check valve in place, so you can still drain the tank into the hose. And also it does not have a gauge on it anywhere, so you can't determine what your incoming pressure is. And you can overpressurize your tank. What about a dry fill, which is basically a gravity drain that's labeled dry fill, but may have some other things engineered into it. Every one of those dry fills, and I'm talking BLM trucks here because they have them mostly, every one of those dry fills will say, do not exceed 50 PSI. Well, when you hook up to that thing, it's a direct line into the tank. What's the pressure? We don't know. If you're up at Ochocon Ranger Station, it's probably 75 PSI. If I'm right here, it's probably 40, because I have a gauge, right? But if I'm plugged into my number 8 and I have a intake compound gauge, I will know what my incoming pressure is. And equally as important, I'll know what my outgoing pressure is once it's flowing through that, and I shouldn't be exceeding that 50 PSI. But that's already built into the system. It's not going to want to do that. That's why it has such a large discharge going into your tank. Your pump's just not going to be able to keep up. Questions or thoughts? Okay, you want to see a hose collapse? Of course you can. Okay, so to collapse the hose, to have the absolute most impressive backflow prevention in the system, all you have to do is flow your system with your pump idling. And if your pump is idling and you lose your supply, it will collapse right here. And you'll see it if you're standing here. So we'll do that just to demonstrate it. If I can remember how to run a fire hose. Okay, so it's just at an idle. I have 40 PSI coming in, and it's boosting the pressure coming out. We'll talk about intake the gauges in a minute. Basically what I'm looking to do is I try to extract it a little bit. This got softer because it's not a lot of pressure coming in, but if I lose my flow coming into this line, this will collapse. So close that valve. There it goes, it collapsed. Open it back up. All right, do it one more time. Close, and open it back up. Then open it up all the way. So, that prevented any backflow by collapsing this hose. If I'm not running the pump, I still have the same effect, but the pump is effectively on the vacuum side, which is right at the connection on the other end of the hose. That's where it closes. So, one other thing to look at. Okay, now I'm flowing a lot higher volume, right? And this got really soft. Okay, this is an example of exceeding my supply. This pump is capable of pumping more than this hose can bring to it. There it is, it collapsed. That is what causes cavitation. That is something we would like to avoid in general. Not in general. That is something we need to avoid. So, we exceeded the supply of the truck, which was probably less than 100 gallons a minute. available right here, probably significantly less, even though 1.5-inch hose will carry about 100 gallons a minute. I bet we're not getting more than about 30 out of this system just because of the low pressure of it and whatnot. But if you exceed your supply, like a pump in series, or if you're pumping off of a fire hydrant or whatever, and your hose starts to collapse, that's your indicator that you are causing cavitation, you are exceeding your supply. And the other thing to know about, intake compound gauge. So, it's a test question at Engine Academy. How am I flowing water? That's closed. Oh, my number 2 is completely open. That's it. So you're supposed to close everything before you start. I didn't follow my own rules. So here we go. I just water hammered her up to about 50 PSI on the intake side. That's interesting. So I have 50 PSI incoming pressure. When I fired this pump up, it will take that 50 PSI and it'll boost it. In fact, if I look at it, it's only got 40 PSI on the other side of the pump. So there's a little bit of loss there, not because of friction, because nothing's moving. Just happens to be a little bit of loss. Could be inaccuracy of gauges, whatever. When I fire the pump up, the pressure that the pump creates is compounded onto the incoming pressure. So it'll read accurately what the total output is, but you'll get higher pressures when you bring pressure into the pump. You'll also get a higher performance, and you can end up moving more water than you normally can by having pressurized water come into your pump. If you're pumping water in, you can get more water going out on the other end. So you got to be careful when you're doing series pumping. Just something to pay attention to. The key here is we're down to 40 PSI on my intake, which isn't very much. 30 PSI is kind of my bare minimum. If all I'm doing is flowing water back into the tank here, I'm not too worried about it because I'm not trying to pump off of it. But if I drop my intake, every time let me rephrase that. When I open a discharge and I start flowing water, I'm going to lose some of this residual pressure because that's static. Once I get to flow pressure, like I open a discharge valve, okay, and it dropped down to about 30, right around 30. Now it's pouring out bottom. If I get below 30, I probably don't want to be pumping off of that. 30 is kind of the minimum incoming that I'm okay with continuing to run my pump at a point where I'm boosting pressure to pump a hose blade. So that would be my key piece, is about 30 PSI. I think 20 is the official formal, what my friends at the fire department say is where they're not going to open another line once they hit 20 PSI of incoming. But it will drop as you boost down. Just like when we cranked it up, if you watch that part of the video again, you can probably see this gauge and it would show 0 because it had no pressure coming in because the line was collapsed. So the more you flow through it, the less residual pressure you're going to have on that end of it. Questions? Thoughts?